This video now, it's not the sermon. And when it comes to preparing a sermon, the input's always going to be greater than the output. We spend hours in prepping sermons. We don't spend hours in preaching to you, which you may well be thankful for. But it does mean that there are lots of things that we don't necessarily get to touch on. Some because of time constraints, others just because it might confuse the message if we're trying to follow this thread through. I thought it worth us just spending a little time looking at Matthew 10 verse 23, because this wasn't something that we looked at in the sermon. We focused really on the passages about do not be afraid. Now in Matthew 10:23, Jesus says, when you are persecuted in one place, flee to another. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. And at various points in history, people have read this and said, oh, well, Jesus was mistaken because his kingdom wasn't fully established on the earth in the life of his disciples. Now, he's got it wrong here. But what that shows, I think, is probably two things. One, failing to recognize that these words of Jesus do extend beyond the 12 to the mission of the wider church, as we looked at. But also a misunderstanding of what it means for the Son of Man to come. The language that is used there really comes to us from Daniel. So Daniel chapter 7, Daniel has this vision, and he says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And here the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven is not a reference to the Son of Man returning to earth as though coming down on a cloud. It's a reference to the Son of Man, to Jesus, being brought to the Ancient of Days, to his Father, to be given authority and power. And this reference here to the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, it doesn't so much refer to a period of time as though Jesus' second coming. It refers to a position of authority. And so when we talk about the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, even as we sang about this morning, don't just think purely in terms of Jesus' return to earth, but think about Jesus' rule and his reign with power and authority. And the way that it is used in Matthew's gospel is in various ways referring to different periods of time. As I said, it's not so much a reference to a period of time, but a reference to a position of authority. And that can be seen at different periods of time. And so in Matthew 24, when the disciples ask Jesus, when are these words that you said about these stones being broken down going to come true? When is this prophecy about the destruction of the Jerusalem temple going to happen? And Jesus says, look, this is going to happen within the generation that hear these words, within 40 years. And it did. In 70 AD, the temple was destroyed. And he speaks there about the sign of the Son of Man being seen, coming on the clouds of heaven. There's not a reference to Jesus returning to earth, but a reference to his power and authority being seen as the temple is destroyed, that the temple is no longer seen as that power and the authority. The authority doesn't belong to the temple priests, it belongs to Christ. But then also in that same chapter, Jesus then speaks about his return, his second coming, his parousia being the fancy term that's used. And then goes on to say in verse 44, you must be ready because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. That's the same language that's used in Daniel 7. This time, though, referring to Jesus' power and authority being seen when he returns to earth, where he's ruling and reigning here on earth as he is in heaven. Another place it's used, and this is just 3 examples, is in Matthew 28. So when Jesus sends out the disciples with the Great Commission, the language that he uses is language that points us back to Daniel 7. Make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you, because all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me. That's picking up again the language from Daniel 7. And so this image of the coming of the Son of Man, the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven, it doesn't necessarily refer to Jesus' return to earth. It might do if it's used in that context. But it refers to the rule and reign of Jesus. And so in verse 23, when we read about, when you're persecuted, flee to one place. Truly I tell you, you will not finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. That could refer to a whole variety of events in history, or even future events in history. But I think the point is this, and the thing to encourage us is that ultimately the thing that everything is moving towards is the rule and reign of Christ. They're being persecuted, having to flee from one place to another. That's not how it's going to end. That's not the final end of the story. Jesus reigns, he rules. And whatever it is that you are going through, we face a mild form of persecution, I think, compared to other countries. It may intensify in the years to come. But know that that is not the end. That the end is Jesus' rule and his reign. That is what will be seen. And that is what will be celebrated. So let's take comfort in that his dominion is an everlasting dominion. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed.